So I feel you 100% on that. So how about we take, yeah, you feel like taking some of these questions real quick
Yeah,
as
let's
we
take any of them.
as we kind of wind down. So I got a few highlighted. So the first one I want to get to, because this is the one I wasn't planning on broaching, just out of respect, but I saw you respond to somebody and you were like, "Yeah, let's do it." So I might as well bring it up. Um, I've been in gear a couple of times. I've been in a squat suit, been in a bench shirt, single ply,
Mhm.
worst feeling of my life, claustrophobic, hurt like shit. And the thing that stood out is, how technical it has to be. It's a completely different ball game, and the
Mhm.
capacity for overload, because we do a bit of overload in strongman, but nothing that isolated as far as isolating specifically for load. So I get why, as the gear got better over the years, the dynamics of the lift changed. That makes sense. But to a lot of guys that aren't involved in equipped lifting, or it's just kind of an oddity that pops up on their channel every now and then or on their YouTube feed, what do you have to say to the internet guys that pull apart the squat depth?
Well, it's been an issue in powerlifting since back in the day when Kaz and Cone and everyone lifted, but there wasn't video cameras everywhere.
That's a good point.
There's no, yeah, it's the truth because I know people that attended these meets, Anthony Clark and Kaz and all these guys back in the day, and some things got passed. Sometimes things slipped through. Sometimes things were blatantly bad. I mean, there's even the story of some people think that when Ed Cohn lifted Multi-Ply, that his squat was high. He
Really?
said his squat was high, but he did it. Yeah, he squatted 1,038, 242 in 2001 or 2002. He cleaned house. He lifted Multi-Ply a couple times. I bet people out there didn't know that. But he talked about shaving the squat to get the money. So here's the thing: with equipped lifting being kind of in the rearview mirror at the time or now, and that was the thing then. Um, Squat depth with equipped lifting is never going to look like a raw lifter burying a
Sure,
squat.
absolutely.
So let's get one thing established. So what is squat depth? If
That's
you
actually
look
that's
in
the
the rule
question.
books, so squat depth is not convincingly deep. It is breaking parallel. So yeah, some people break parallel by 4 or 5 inches, but the IPF's interpretation of parallel depends on the day, and then the APF, and then of course the USPA. It just depends on it. But as a whole, when someone's squatting 3 feet wider than someone does raw,
Uh huh.
this range of motion is going to be short. You can sit up straighter and you can sit back, which is going to cause you to hit depth way faster than someone hinging forward. It's very simple. Sit up. The hips are going to hit depth first. Someone leaning forward, the hips are not going to hit depth as quick. So
Absolutely.
that's why you see a lot of raw lifters that look like they're buried a squat. You look at the side and they're breaking parallel, but not like you think. So are there some high squats that have been passed in equipped lifting? Yes. But you got to remember that cameras are not 3D. Yes, they can look bad and even worse on video, but you cannot see any type of depth on a camera. I'm talking about the curtains behind you. They just look flat. I can't see them.
Yeah.
I can't see if they're the depth on them. So that's a problem when anyone goes ballistic. An angle could look terrible on something. It can look absolutely terrible on a lift, and the next thing you know, you see a different angle. You're like, oh, that looks a little bit different, or a snippet cut out, or
Sure.
whatever, or the angle. So it's people have always complained about high squats, and a lot of the time it comes down to this: when someone doesn't understand the gear, they're used to seeing their favorite lifter sink their butt on the ground, or they're used to seeing Olympic lifters who squat their ass on the ground. They don't understand the difference between a powerlifting squat and an Olympic lifting squat. I'm not saying that equipped lifts are buried. I squat for lights, and I always have. I've got 60 plus squats over 1,000 pounds in a meet. So, am I the problem, or is it equipped lifting the problem? I don't know, but I've always lifted for lights, and I've been doing it for 20 years. So, I don't really have an opinion on it because I just don't care.
Well, and I think that's valid. And when I'm picking it apart myself, it's I can, again, knowing when you have these suits that have been better engineered every year for the last several decades to provide more support and allow for bigger totals, bigger overload. It makes sense. I could accept cleanly that, well, this is an equipped squat, it's accepted that it's gonna be on average higher let's say a couple inches than your average raw squat, whatever. And that makes sense to me. I think, and I know for myself, when I've been critical, when I've watched it, it has more to do with, and you said that you pointed out, there's been a problem since powerlifting's been a thing with consistency, right? And everybody being on the same page for what is good and what's not. And God, I've only been to a couple of quit meets to watch, and it's when they were at the Arnold. I've been to the Arnold a couple times. We were watching, I think, the West Side Open, and we were watching it in the gym, and somebody asked me what they were gauging depth off of, and for the life of me, I just didn't have an answer. Because there were some that, and again, the camera, the camera doesn't tell the whole story, but there's some where I'm like, that looked pretty good, and it'd get reds, and it's like, oh well, that one was high as shit, and it'd get whites, and then you think of, people talk about politics, people talk about fixing the judges and all the other things that go on behind the scenes, but it's nature of the beast, right?
Yeah, and then of course, the obvious is the judges on the side to look at the hip crease, not the front. So, that's another thing too. Most squats are not filmed from the side.
Yeah.
No, I'm not saying you can't see us. If a squat to someone is obviously high, it's just going to throw that's high no matter what I see. So, it's just, I don't know. It's just one of those things that it's always been. Equipped lifters don't squat nearly as deep as raw lifters, and raw lifters don't squat nearly as much as equipped lifters.
Sure thing. Yeah. All right, let's go to, we got a couple, let's see.
It doesn't hurt my feelings if anyone calls me a high squatter. It's not going to be everyone's cup of tea. But you got to remember, you're not going to see the hip crease like you will when someone's wearing a singlet versus 2 layers of gear. And last thing that I want to say, just real quick, is that the gear hasn't changed in the last 15 years. Now, the band shirts have changed. That's the exception. Those came out about 7 years ago or so. But as far as the canvas suit that was introduced in the early 2000s, the Super Duper Phenom, which is still the best bench shirt on the market, Gene Reich selected the world record at 5 in that. So
really?
The technology, although more gear companies make better gear now, there's a reason why Ed Cohn bought all the marathon wraps he could in the 90s because they were the best knee wrap. So everyone's always searched after the best gear in that era. And Enzer, who has made the Leviathan, who has one of the biggest squats of all time in it, the Super Phenom, which does have the biggest bench ever, and the other gear that's made, this was all developed and out in 04, 05. So we've gotten a lot stronger in the gear, learn how to load the bones, to be able to take it, and the joints, and then the muscles, and then how to train in the gear and out of the gear. But for a lot of people, it's a lot of complexities to understand. And I get why people just be like, it looks stupid, I don't want to bother with that. I understand why they would say that.
Well, what stands out to me is and it's one of the critiques that I have. It's like, if you want to be, let's say, a trophy hunter, it kind of makes sense to do it in an area where there's less competition. So I'm looking at like, okay, equipped lifting, there's a lot less competition. But on the other hand, there's less competition, there's less people doing it because it's so damn hard to do, right? It requires a crew. It requires, the people have to show up. You can't do... I'm sure how many times you get over 1,000 pounds in your training building up to a 1,300 pound squat. You need a bunch of guys to do that. And that's what lends itself to the difficulty. It's right. The overload, it's balancing the variables, it's recovering around that shear load and having enough people that can actually help you make that a reality. And I over time, I take people at their word, when they describe what the experience is like, it's a different animal. It's, I train at 2 a.m. by myself. No big deal. I can run through all my stuff and I know what I'm building up to, but the commitment seems to be a lot more rigorous.